The southern colonies. The shaded area in Figure 4.6 shows the southern colonies. The southern colonies included 5 colonies. They were Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The southern colonies were different from the New England colonies in many ways. The environment of the southern colonies. First, we're going to talk about their climate. The climate of the southern colonies was the warmest of the 3 colonial regions. Because the southern colonies are farther south, they had long, hot summers, mild winters, and long growing seasons. The warm climate also allowed colonists to grow crops that were hard to grow in Europe. The climate of the southern colonies was mild winters and a long growing season. Climate and the colonists' health. Climate also affected the colonists in the southern colonies in a positive and negative way, but the effect was the opposite of what happened in the New England colonies. Winters in the southern colonies were much milder, so colonists did not have to worry about surviving freezing winter conditions. Therefore, the warmer climate was a positive factor for the colonists. The warmer southern climate was also a negative factor. Because of the warm, moist climate, disease that killed colonists, such as malaria, were able to spread rapidly. The climate negatively affected their lifespan of the colonists. Colonists in the South were more likely to die of disease than colonists who lived in the New England or Middle colonies. Geography of the southern colonies. Each one of the southern colonies bordered on the Atlantic Ocean. The geography of this area near the shoreline consisted of a broad plain. In some places, the coastal plain went inland for several hundred miles. Away from the coastal plain, the land was hilly and covered with thick forests. Most of the first colonists in the South settled near the coast. Much of that coastal land was flat and had rich soil. Natural resources of the southern colonies. In addition to their rich farmlands, the southern colonies had many other natural resources. For instance, some southern colonists, especially in North Carolina, harvested lumber for their forests or caught fish along their ocean coasts. However, other than farmland, the southern colonists never fully developed their natural resources because farming was how they made their money. Economic activities in the southern colonies. First, we're going to start by talking about their agriculture, and they had a lot of it. Agriculture in the southern colonies. The southern colonies were geographically made up of more flat land than either the New England or Middle colonies. Not only was the ground flat, but the soil found in the South was fertile and rich. The rich soil allowed the southern colonists to grow cash crops to sell to traders. The environmental factors of flat ground, rich soil, and a long growing season made farming in the southern colonies the most productive of all 3 regions. Because the land was so productive, because the land was so productive, plantations were started in the southern colonies. Plantations were very large farms that specialized in growing 1 or 2 cash crops. Plantations were much larger than farms in the other 2 colonial regions. Most workers lived right on the plantation, rather than a village or a town, as in New England. The southern colonists were able to generate great wealth from cash crops of tobacco and rice. The southern colonies exported many agricultural products, and they sent most of these agricultural exports to Britain. The southern colonies were important to British traders because the colonies provided Britain with crops that they did not grow well in Britain. The British traders wanted the southern farmers to keep growing those crops. Southern farmers could sell as much as their cash crops as they could grow. Financially, southern farmers were not interested in trying to grow other crops. Manufacturing in the southern colonies. Commercial manufacturing, or making things to sell, in the South was only a small fraction of that found in New England. Some southern colonists made rum, lumber, and parts for ships, like mast, siding, and turpentine. However, most colonists chose to earn their living by farming. Most of the manufactured items that Southern colonists needed were either made at the plantation or were bought from traders. Like natural resources, commercial manufacturing in the Southern colonies was very little because farming was really the way that they chose to make their money. Plantation owners in the South usually had their own craftsmen to make many of the items needed on the plantation. Because most of the craftsmen in the South were employed by plantations, fewer craftsmen started businesses in cities and towns for themselves. The goods or items that could not be made by the plantation craftsmen were purchased directly from British traders. Therefore, industries such as shipbuilding did not develop in the southern colonies as they did in the other two colonial regions. Instead, timber from the pine forests of North Carolina were exported to England or New England, where finished products, including ships, were manufactured. Trade in the southern colonies. Plantation owners grew cash crops that were sold to British traders. The traders took the crops directly to Britain. The southern plantation owners usually bought the things they needed or wanted from British traders rather than colonial traders. Because of the direct trade with Britain, the southern colonies did not develop colonial trade routes between their plantations in the south and the major cities in the New England and Middle colonies. The Southern Triangular Trade. In the southern colonies, traders bought agricultural goods such as tobacco, rice, and cotton. Then the traders took those agricultural products to Britain, where they sold them and bought manufactured trade items such as iron and fabric. The traders then took those items the British manufactured to Africa. In Africa, they traded for gold and African people who had been kidnapped and made slaves. The traders returned to the southern colonies. Religion in the southern colonies. Most of the original southern colonists came from Britain in search of land to farm, not for freedom to practice their own religion. Therefore, many of the southern colonists belonged to the Church of England, just like their families who lived back in Britain. Religion in the southern colonies was influenced by the distances between the farms on which people lived in the towns and cities. Because southern colonists often lived far apart from one another and transportation was not easy, it was much more of a hardship for them to get together for any meeting or to attend church regularly. Although religion provided moral guidance for the southern colonists, ministers did not have great influence or were not very important in the daily lives of the colonists, as did the Puritan ministers in New England. In addition, the Church of England sent ministers from London, so the colonists didn't even get to choose their own ministers. Here's our summary of the southern colonies. The environment affected the economic development of the southern colonies. The geography was mostly flat land with rich soil. The climate was mild winters and a long growing season. The natural resources other than farmland were not developed. Agriculture was cash crops of tobacco, rice, and cotton. Manufacturing was not developed because of agriculture. Trade was exporting agricultural products and importing manufactured products and slaves.